A hospital room, chilly and poorly lit, was my alone. I felt draughty even in my thin hospital gown, and the only sound breaking the stillness was the faint beeping of machinery. The nurse hadn't checked on me in hours. At about midnight, I requested a nurse's assistance by pressing a button, but she did not arrive. Nothing happened the second time I pressed it. Marooned in a hospital room with nothing but my mounting fear and worry. It seemed as though I was cut off from the outside world. I brushed off the impression that someone was observing me as a product of my imagination at first. If you're paranoid, you should avoid hospitals. While I was in that position, I felt what sounded like very faint footfalls outside my door, as if someone were walking back and forth, pausing every few steps. They were slow and deliberate. Half expecting someone to storm in, I glanced over at the door, but it remained untouched. There was complete quiet after the steady reverberation of those footsteps. The night turned into what seemed like an eternal nightmare. Even though I was just admitted for a minor procedure, something normal. From the minute I stepped foot in that strange place, I knew I didn't want to spend any more time than was absolutely required there. Some sections of the facility were obviously out of date due to its age. Although the personnel was professional, it seemed like they were trying to avoid answering some queries. The door handle to my room subsequently shifted, not in a scary way, but slowly, as if someone were testing it and attempting to turn it without making a sound. As my pulse raced and my gaze fixed on the entrance, I came to a complete standstill. It faded away after a while, but the sound of breathing on the opposite side remained, breathing that is heavy and laborious, as if someone were unwell or in agony. When I attempted to make sense of it, my breath got trapped in my throat. Who was that? A patient? Someone on staff? I don't understand why they would try to open the door in such a manner in the dead of night. What prevented them from simply entering? At last, I mustered the nerve to shout, "Is that you? Who could it be?" No response. Gasps of air were exhaled. With my legs numb from inactivity, I slid out of bed and cautiously made my way to the entrance. It was as if the seconds ticked by on the wall clock. The haunting silence of the night was all I could think about since my phone had died. While making my way to my accommodation, I had earlier passed by a dilapidated and abandoned hospital wing. "Do not enter" was fading on the doormat that led to it, and the doors were locked. I recalled inquiring about it with the nurse. Instead, she merely grinned tightly and shifted the conversation's focus. Perhaps this explains why, when I heard the same footsteps around the same time, I couldn't help but feel uneasy that they were emanating from that direction. The only sound coming from the hallway's machinery was a faint hum, so I pushed my ear to it. I cautiously swung open the door, almost anticipating the presence of a stranger. Yet, nobody else was in sight down the hall. As the lights dimmed, ever so slightly, odd shadows began to trace their paths along the walls. Nobody had much of a place to hide, because my room was at the very end of the hall. Just a few steps away is the door of the abandoned wing. I drew nearer to it, my pulse racing. The identical "do not enter" sign was staring back at me, but the door's lock appeared different this time. It had become almost unlocked. Someone had apparently pried it open not long ago. In spite of my better sense, I extended my hand to grasp the handle. The temperature was low, nearly freezing. As soon as the door swung wide, a heavy metallic odor enveloped me, turning my stomach in an instant. Even though my vision was severely impaired, I sensed an eerie presence and knew something was up with this location. Out of nowhere, someone firmly grasped my shoulder, with my heart racing. I quickly spun around to find a nurse standing there. Her eyes were big and her face pallid. "You shouldn't be here," she muttered with a quiver in her voice. She bore no resemblance to the nurses who had previously attended to me. She ushered me back to my room and slammed the door. Before I could speak, she reiterated, "It's not safe," but never clarified. Once again, I passed the locked door on my way out. The sign had vanished this time. As if it had never been touched, the door was sealed shut. It was all over after that. Later, another nurse came to see how I was doing, and she pretended like nothing out of the ordinary had transpired. They appeared bewildered when I inquired about the woman who had stopped me. Her description did not match anyone on staff. The following morning, I was released from the hospital, still frightened but ready to go. I still have no idea who or what was in that abandoned hospital wing, and ever since then, I've avoided medical facilities like the plague. I am still troubled by the incident. In the middle of the night, I can still feel the nurse's fear as she placed her hand on my shoulder. Anything that might have been beyond that door. I'm thankful I didn't find out. That's all. If you like this horrifying horror story, please consider subscribing for more. In addition to being the sole open option on that remote stretch of road, I was also exhausted and starving. It had that classic diner vibe: metal siding, red leather boots, and the pungent stench of grease that accompanies every small town establishment. A little after midnight, and then the trucker was alone at the counter, while the waitress leaned against the register, engrossed in her phone. Nearly everyone else had left. The trucker glanced up, but she remained motionless. As I moved into a booth separate from everyone else, his gaze followed. It didn't really register with me. I was not in the mood to cope with the creeps, which truckers always gave me. Plus, it was late. I could still feel the trucker's eyes on me. Despite my best efforts to avoid meeting his gaze, I could feel his intense scrutiny. However, he wasn't the only one. There was an air of mystery and unease throughout the establishment, as if something was amiss, but nobody dared to speak up. After bringing my coffee, the waitress returned to her phone, scrolling at the register. She avoided looking me directly in the eyes. At long last, the waitress approached. She appeared pale and exhausted, as if she had spent days there. With a muttering, "The coffee is fresh," she gave me a greasy menu. Her speech sounded mechanical and lifeless. To get a burger, I merely nodded. When I noticed it, that was it. The restaurant was devoid of ambient noise, not loud enough. Outside, the only sound is the hum of the neon sign. Within, there is complete silence. Suddenly, I detected the distinct sound of something scraping, which was initially muted but later became audible. It wasn't coming from the kitchen or the counter. It was coming from under the booth where I was sitting. With my hand halfway to my cup, I froze. It felt as if something was lurking under the seat, patiently waiting to be scratched. My sneaker made an unwelcome screech against the tile as I slid out of the booth. Despite my best efforts to blend in, still staring at me, the trucker flashed a little contorted smile as if he knew something I didn't. With my heart racing, I crouched down and peered behind the booth. Not a single thing. Nothing occupied the room. A nervous sigh escaped my lips as I reassured myself that it was all in my head, and that I was simply exhausted. I returned to my seat. However, the uneasy sensation persisted. There was no longer any scratching. However, from this point on, there was an oppressive aura. It felt as if the restaurant was keeping tabs on me. After returning with my burger, the waitress left. As she silently set it down in front of me, I couldn't help but notice something as she walked away. The muck had caked onto her shoes. I hadn't seen her go, but the mud seemed fresh, as if she had stepped in from the outside. The food was off limits to me. That is just not possible for me. The very thought made me feel queasy and had the hairs on my neck stand on end. I had to leave that place immediately. Taking my jacket with me, I tossed a crumpled $20 bill onto the table and made my way to the exit. However, the trucker's icy grasp seized my wrist as I went by him. "It dislikes it when people depart," he muttered as he drew near. I wrenched my arm free and ran screaming out of the restaurant. Even though the biting night air felt like a slap in the face, I kept sprinting until I reached my car. My eyes darted back to the eatery as I mangled my keys. With that same twisted smirk, the trucker stood in the window, staring at me. The waitress was visible behind him in the neon lights ebb and flow. However, she had shifted her position, away from the register. From behind my booth, she was emerging on all fours. I accelerated to the maximum, slicing out of the parking lot and continuing to drive non-stop until I was many miles distant. Both the cafe and that road have never been on my radar again. Still, I occasionally hear the same scratching noises. In the middle of the night, it's barely audible, hidden behind the walls or beneath the bed. It still has me wondering if it has followed me home each time. It all began with a typical late-night haul. I had a route plan that would take me from Oregon to Nevada. transporting building supplies along long miles of lonely roadways. For all the years I've spent behind the wheel, the one thing I've learned is how desolate these highways can get as the sun goes down. You're alone with the road, with only the fleeting glimmer of another truck's headlights to break the silence. It was cooler than normal tonight. The effects of the coffee I had taken at my previous rest stop were starting to wear off. After 8 hours of continuous driving, at the next rest break, I pulled over for a short snack and coffee because I could feel my eyes becoming weary. I noticed Miller's Diner, which is open 24/7 and welcomes truckers, at that moment. Although I had traveled this route many times, the name Miller's Diner was new to me. But you never know when a site like that will materialize. It happens frequently in this industry. After seeing the exit sign, I rolled into the parking lot in search of a warm supper. A few more trucks were parked outside, and the neon sign, which beeped and flickered in the darkness, belonged to a bygone era. A deafening silence pervaded the air. The aroma of greasy food and stale cigarettes was the first thing that hit me as soon as I came inside, with the exception of one waitress stationed behind the counter. The establishment was nearly deserted. The expression on her face said it all: exhausted, worn down by life, and barely paying attention to me. Hunched over his coffee, a man sat in one of the rear booths, his eyes fixed on the table as if it had the secrets to life and death. I sat down next to the front window since I wanted to be alone. A blank face instead of a grin or "how are you doing?" greeted the waitress as she shuffled over. I placed my order for a burger and coffee, attempting to avoid making small talk, but something just seemed strange. Something seemed off as she made her way back to the kitchen. Ever since I walked in, the man at the rear had remained still. There was not the slightest movement or sip of his coffee. It was as if time had ground to a halt there. An unearthly anxiety settled over me as the droning hum of the overhead lights persisted. I inquired as to whether or not she encountered many trucks in this area when the waitress returned with my coffee. She only shrugged and muttered, "Not many," without even looking me in the eye. I drank a little of the Joe, quite chilly. I turned my head to look at the man in the booth, but this time my focus was elsewhere, as if he had been working in the dirt. His hands were nearly black with grime. His coffee hadn't cooled down, unlike mine. I noticed then the steam was still coming from the cup, and it appeared to be entirely unaltered. I tried to convince myself that I was simply exhausted, but as I remained seated, the air seemed to weigh me down, as if the cafe were pushing in on me. It became too much for me to bear. The waitress paid no attention when I flipped her off and demanded the bill. Her expression was one of complete disengagement as she gazed beyond me in silence. After that, the door swung open with a squeak. Comes another trucker, a towering figure. Thin as a ghost, he wore a bulky coat, adorned with insignia from several governments. As he looked around, I caught a glimpse of recognition or perhaps fear in his eyes as they met mine. As silently as he had entered, he spun around and bolted out the door. I felt compelled to trail behind him. I had the impression I had to leave that place immediately. I decided to just leave a little bit of cash on the table and go. The icy wind pounded me as I made my way to my rig. I was prepared to leave that location behind as I hopped into the cab and started the engine. My first stop on the highway was a quick check of my rearview mirror. It seemed like the diner had vanished. Not a single light, not a single indication, absolutely nothing. No light at all where it formerly was. When my pulse rate increased, I accelerated rapidly while clutching the wheel with such force that my knuckles grew white. I continued driving till dawn. Since then, I've taken that road several times, but I still haven't spotted Miller's Diner, interacted with other truckers, residents, and anybody else who could have information regarding it. Pretty much, nobody knows what it is. The silence and chill of the coffee shop, though, will stay with me forever. As I travel those endless lengths of road in the dead of night, thoughts of that location sometimes cross my mind, and I can't help but wonder what may have transpired had I lingered there longer, or reconsidered my departure time. You can get where you need to go on some roads. Some people lead you to unexpected destinations.